So it turns out that human growth and development are not linear, and after watching this video, it's going to make more sense to you why so many spiritual teachers and other people who seem highly evolved happen to get into trouble with sexual misconduct with their students. Okay, so this video is on multiple intelligences, which was a term popularized by Howard Gardner in his book from the 1980s by the same title. I'm approaching it from a different angle, which is the work of Ken Wilber, and he calls them lines of development. It doesn't matter what we call them, the concept is simple and it's going to be powerful. Before I get into the nuts and bolts about multiple intelligences, I want to lay out a couple of other concepts that are going to really fill out the picture. One of those concepts has to do with science and the three strands of deep science, also known as the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation. One of the reasons that this concept of the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation is so valuable is because a lot of time in empirical science, people get the idea that meditation or spiritual practice cannot be adequately scientifically studied, or that these endeavors are inherently unscientific, which is actually far from the truth. The other concept I'll be sharing before I get into multiple intelligences is something that I think of as the pre-post confusion. Ken Wilber calls it the pre-post fallacy, and there's some important lessons here from social movements, as well as helping to fill out our own understanding of how human growth and development happens, and some false dichotomies that have made it into our language that get in the way of seeing things really clearly. So I'll lay out these concepts and then we'll get into multiple intelligences. So the three strands of valid knowledge accumulation, which are also known as the three strands of deep science, are the following. I'll give you the technical terms first, and then we'll unpack them and make them really easy to understand. The first is an injunction, the second is apprehension, and the third is confirmation or refutation by a community of the adequate. So an injunction, you can think of this as a proposition or a challenge. See, science doesn't say just observe. Science says do this and then observe. For example, if you want to know if cells have a nucleus, science says learn how to stain slides for a microscope and learn how to use a microscope, then look through the microscope and see what you find. So science typically says do this, then observe. That's the injunction, also known as a proposition or some kind of challenge. Check this out. The second strand of valid knowledge accumulation is known as apprehension, which basically means my own perception. So check your personal experience. You stained the slides, you looked through the microscope, now what do you see? So that's the second strand, is what are you perceiving? What is your personal experience? The third is confirmation or refutation by a community of similarly developed practitioners. For example, if you're doing some kind of exercise on theoretical math and you want to check your work with me, I would be the worst person, because theoretical math is not my thing. I'm not part of that community of the adequate. I'm not developed in theoretical math to be able to check your work. So what you do is you go to people who are recognized theoretical mathematicians or a professor of theoretical math, and then you can get your work checked by somebody there that gets confirmed or refuted about what you're experiencing. So how this relates to meditation. For example, I went and I sat a 10-day Vipassana meditation course. Again, they didn't say just observe. They said, do this. Sit, close your eyes, observe your breath in this way, or do these things in this way. That's the first strand. The second, check your own experience, which is also what you do. Then, check your own experience against other people who are highly developed in that particular area. Check it out with a teacher. Hey, I experienced this, or I experienced this. And they can say, oh, that makes sense, because as you're progressing, that's one of the things that you experience. Or they might give me some kind of correction. Oh, the reason you're experiencing that is because of the way you're sitting, or you might need to shift something, or try working less intensely and just do it a little more lightly. They can give you tips and pointers. That's the whole point about the experts or the community of the adequate or similarly developed. These three strands apply to anything in empirical science. By empirical, I mean that which comes through our senses, so things that we can weigh and measure in the world out there. So for example, if I want to know if it's raining, I'll look out the window. And then I check my own experience. It's raining or it's not raining. And then I can ask other people, hey, is it raining out? And then we can all confirm or refute whether or not it's raining. Pretty straightforward. But let's go back to the example of theoretical math. Nobody accuses theoretical math of being unscientific, and yet not one person in the world has ever seen the square root of -2 running around in the woods or in the city. It just doesn't happen. That's not something that we can pick up with our senses. But nobody accuses theoretical math of being unscientific. So it's the same with spiritual practice, with meditation, and as we get into multiple intelligences, that whether you're talking about interior things having to do with consciousness, with your internal experience, with intentions, things that cannot be weighed or measured, that we can still apply rigorous scientific methodology to these things. The next thing we'll look at is the pre-post confusion, which Ken Wilber calls the pre-post fallacy. Check out this slide so you can read along with me. In any recognized developmental sequence, the confusion of a pre-X stage and a trans-X stage simply because both are non-X. This fallacy has two major forms: the reduction of trans-X to pre-X and the elevation of pre-X to trans-X. Hang in there, I know this is dense, but I'm going to break this down for you. For example, the confusion of pre-rational and trans-rational, pre-personal and transpersonal, or pre-conventional and post-conventional. So let me explain what this means and why it's important. Basically, we have this false dichotomy, like rational, non-rational. And depending on your point of view or which side of the camp you're on, rational is good, non-rational is bad, or rational is bad, non-rational is good. So what actually happens is that we have stages of development: pre-rational to rational to post-rational or trans-rational. For example, my 6-month-old, if I have a 6-month-old child, they're not yet able to sort of reason things out and here's evidence and draw conclusions. They're still at a pre-rational stage. They're also at a pre-verbal stage. Once they start to be able to reason things out and think things through, we can say that they're at a rational stage. And then if they experience, for example, if they have a peak experience or a mystical experience, we can call that a trans-rational or a post-rational type of experience. Or like very high levels of intuition, for example, can be thought of as post-rational or trans-rational. When we're talking about social movements, and this is where this is so valuable, let's just rewind. There's a very obvious example that goes back several years to something called the Battle in Seattle. And this was when the World Trade Organization had a big meeting in Seattle and the streets were shut down. Let me explain what the WTO is. It's a treaty between countries that says that corporations can sue your local government if your environmental laws or health laws get in the way of that corporation's profits. It's really important to understand this stuff if you care about the future of the world. For example, there was a Canadian corporation that sued the state of California because California stated that there was an additive to gasoline that was a known carcinogen. And this corporation sued California saying, I'm sorry, but your health laws are getting in the way of my profit. And under the WTO, my profit is protected over your health laws or environmental laws, etc. So going back to the Battle of Seattle, one of the things that you saw in Seattle were hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets peacefully. And you saw labor movement and the environmental movement coming together and finding common ground. I attended some teach-ins in the Seattle Opera House put on by Jerry Mander's organization, where you had panels of speakers, like a whole panel of small farmers, and they talked about the WTO versus small farmers. And then there was a whole panel on experts on sea turtles, talking about sea turtles versus the WTO and all that. Now, there were maybe 30 or so self-proclaimed anarchists who were smashing windows and breaking newspaper boxes and things like that, and most of the media focused on them. If the WTO was considered, let's say, the conventional worldview or the conventional mindset, then everyone else who was against the WTO would be considered non-conventional. There's that false dichotomy, conventional versus non-conventional. So that's lumping together all the people who have reasoned arguments about the WTO with the people who are just basically smashing windows and just want to tear down the system. And what we have is actually a developmental progression. So we have pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. So if the WTO was conventional, a post-conventional argument against the WTO would sound like some of what I've explained. The WTO is a treaty, and when a corporation sues a local government, that is decided in a closed room by a secret tribunal of former corporate lawyers who get to decide whether the corporation wins or whether small farmers win or the sea turtles. And in every case that's come before the WTO, corporations have won out. That would be a post-conventional argument against the WTO. What do you think a pre-conventional argument against the WTO sounds like? It sounds like this. Down with the man! Down with the system! Tear it down! Did I blow out your speakers on your computer? That's what it sounds like. It sounds like a 4-year-old temper tantrum to me. You actually need to understand what they're talking about to have a reasoned argument, and if you don't, then it becomes an anti type of reaction. So then it's just down with the system, tear it down, but you're not talking about what's going to replace it or what's next, and it's not something most people really actually want to listen to. So when we lump together the pre-conventional protesters with the post-conventional protesters, we're actually taking people who have very, very different worldviews or approaches for how to deal with what the problem is. So we want to recognize that in many situations where we have this dichotomy of X versus non-X, rational versus non-rational, conventional versus non-conventional, there might actually be a developmental sequence of pre, and then the thing we're talking about, and then post. And that's an important concept to understand when we get into the meat and potatoes of our video, which is multiple intelligences. So I mentioned that the concept of multiple intelligences was popularized by Howard Gardner in his book by the same title, Multiple Intelligences. And what his book basically argued is that logical mathematical intelligence is really the only kind that's emphasized in schools, and some people thrive and shine in other areas, and it's not the only kind of intelligence. So some people have musical intelligence and kinesthetic intelligence, and there's emotional intelligence, and so many different types of intelligences. I believe Howard Gardner recognizes 9 or 10 different multiple intelligences, whereas Ken Wilber, for example, recognizes over 24 different, what he calls lines of development. In other words, anything that I could get better at, we could say there's a developmental sequence. So, for example, basketball. I happen to suck at basketball, but if I worked on it and I got better, we would see a progression. We would see that I'm getting better in different areas. So, for example, my dribbling might get better and my free throw shooting might get better. And as I work on my basketball line of development or my basketball intelligence gets higher. But for something to actually be considered a multiple intelligence or a line of development, it has to be based on research. There's solid research that backs up when something is actually considered a developmental line. So informally, we can talk about anything that I can get better at. But in a strict sense, we're really talking about things that have to be based on research. However, the basic idea is I'm better at some things than others, and you're better at some things than others, and everybody is better at some things than other things. So check out this slide right here. It basically talks about how human growth and development is uneven. We've got 2 people here. You can see under cognitive development, one person is more highly developed than the other person, and I added their pre-rational, rational, trans-rational. Or in moral development, we have pre-conventional or egocentric, and then we have conventional or ethnocentric, and then post-conventional or world-centric in moral development. And again, these 2 different people have a different level of development on the moral line, and the same on the musical line. Same on the psychosexual line and the spiritual line of development. We're treating spirituality here as a line of development in this graph. So in the next graph, I've actually separated these two people out, and you can see how, for example, person 1 is a little bit more evenly developed, and person 2 is much more unevenly developed. But person 2 is really off the charts cognitively, and they're off the charts musically and even spiritually. Let's say they've been able to develop a sense of really deep spiritual awareness. But that same person who might be very high cognitive, very high musical, might be a very charismatic individual, but they're kind of stagnant on the psychosexual line of development, and they're kind of stagnant on the moral line of development. How many spiritual teachers can you tick off who might have been very charismatic and very developed in certain areas, but who got into trouble with sexual misconduct with their students? This tells us why. Because human growth and development is not linear. So we find a superstar in some area. Maybe musically they're a superstar, or maybe athletically they're a superstar. And it's so easy for us to project onto them, oh, they must be amazing in all these other areas. Or somebody is an amazing philosopher like Ken Wilber, and then we assume, oh, he must be super developed in all these different areas. Well, it doesn't happen that way. Human growth and development is a little messy, and it's not linear. But this lets you know that you have so many areas to work on. Now, the goal is not necessarily to get, to the top, to be, be at a 10 on all the different lines of development. That's not necessarily the goal. But it is important that you be aware of these things so that you can be sensitized to how you might be really good at some things, but not so great at others. And other people might be great in some areas and not different ones that you are great at. So just keep that in mind, and you can use it as a way to intentionally work on the areas where you think you have work to do. The goal here really is for you to be aware and informed. The goal is not that you're going to be a decathlon gold medalist in every line of development. It's really valuable that you just be aware and informed. And specialization is okay. I think of the lines of development for each of us as kind of our superpowers. And I want my clients, for example, to leverage their superpowers. Superman didn't get bummed out that he couldn't swim underwater like Aquaman. Aquaman didn't get bummed out that he didn't have, the cool bracelets and the lasso that Wonder Woman had. You lasso somebody and they have to tell the truth, and the bracelets can deflect bullets. Each superhero has their own superpowers, and it's one of the things that I emphasize with my clients is I want you to be connected to that which you excel at and to really leverage that. And it's valuable to be aware of the areas where we might have blind spots or where we might be deficient. There's one other piece here that relates to multiple intelligences and to lines of development, and it has to do with a line of development that's the values line, which was really popularized by spiral dynamics. And the work from spiral dynamics, as it was harnessed by Paul Ray and later on by David Johnston. And I explain this all in the video on social marketing. So I'm not going to go into it here in depth, but I just want to mention it, that it also relates to these lines of development, because you see that as people grow and develop in their values, their worldview shifts, and what's important to them also shifts. Please scroll down, check out the links under the video, and leave me a comment. I would love your feedback. Thank you for watching.
Wow.